I don't know a person on the planet who has never felt disrespected, who's never been excluded for something, who's never felt like somebody was being unfair in the assumptions they were making about them. So what can you do to prevent that from happening on your team? Radical respect is about how to create an organization in which everyone respects each other. And this can be confusing because respect has two very different definitions. One definition is respecting someone's achievements. That's something you have to earn. The second definition is about the kind of unconditional regard that we owe each other for who we really are as human beings. That is not something anyone has to earn. That is kind of a birthright. Sometimes when people talk about radical respect, they sort of dismiss it as like a soft skill, being oversensitive. But if you believe that your team has got to collaborate in order to get great results, you've got to focus on radical respect. Hi, I'm Kim Scott. I am the author of Radical Respect, How to Work Together Better, and Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. Before writing these books, I was an executive at Google and Apple, and before that, I did 3 failed startups. So what gets in the way of radical respect, since that is what we are all intending to create? There's a million things, of course, but I boil it down to 3: bias, prejudice, and bullying. Let's talk about bias. Sometimes it feels like preventing the inevitable because bias, for example, is inevitable. We all have biases. We all exclude others obliviously from time to time. These are very human mistakes that we make all of the time. So what can you do as a leader to prevent bias from getting in the way of your team's ability to do great work? It's not enough as a leader to have good intentions. You've got to build good systems. So you want to make sure that you're designing management systems that take a look at who are you hiring, who are you promoting, how are you deciding to pay people, and is bias creeping into your decisions about who you're firing? When you bring people in to interview, you want to be very conscious of looking for culture add, not culture fit. Because looking for culture fit is like opening up the super highway for bias. There was one time in my career where I found that we did not have a good representation in the people we were interviewing. We were sort of interviewing a very homogeneous group of people. So one of the things I asked the recruiting team to do was to strip personally identifiable information out of resumes and then choose which ones to interview. I was inspired to do this by the example of orchestras. In the 70s, orchestras were like more than 90% men. This probably had something to do with the decision-making process around who was invited to be in the orchestra. And so first they put up a curtain. It didn't change things, but they didn't give up. They didn't say, see, we tried. They realized that there was another bias creeping in, which was you could tell who was a woman because women tended to wear high-heeled shoes, so the interviews. And so they asked everyone who interviewed to take their shoes off. And over time, we now have orchestras that are almost 50-50. So that was an inspiring example, making me realize I needed to do the equivalent of those kinds of interviews where you couldn't see who the person was. Bias creeps into performance management in ways that are insidious. You want to make sure that you are using language properly. I was working with a leader, and he noticed that he didn't have any women on his team. And to his credit, he figured the problem was probably their promotion system. It wasn't the women at the company. And so he invited me to sit in on a promotion meeting and tell him if I noticed anything going wrong. There were 2 people up for promotion, a man and a woman. They both were leading big businesses that were growing fast. The woman's business was a little bit bigger. It was growing a little bit faster, and she had a smaller team, so it was a little bit more profitable. And the team was talking. They were making lots of good points. And finally, somebody said, he's such a great leader. And then another person said, yeah, and she's such a mother hen. And I'm like, all right, guys, back the train up. Like, who are you going to promote, the great leader or the real mother hen? And, at first they were a little defensive and they were like, oh, Kim, we didn't mean it like that. And I said, of course you didn't mean it like that. But you have the power to decide who's getting promoted here. And if you allow bias to creep into this conversation, you're going to promote the wrong person. And not only is that unfair to her, it's bad for the business. They agreed, the right person got promoted, everything was good. It's really important that you take a look at your compensation data and you cut your data by gender, by race, by any form of representation that you're looking to bolster on your team. Because if you don't do that, what you'll find is that unconscious bias kind of creeps into how people get paid. And then you're reflecting and reinforcing market bias. A woman at Salesforce went to Mark Benioff and she said, I think we're systematically underpaying women. This was inconceivable to Mark. And she said, okay, let me run the data, but I want you to make me a very solemn promise. If I run the data and I find that women are consistently being paid less than men, you've got to fix it. He agreed, he made the promise, she ran the data. Indeed, that was the case. And I don't think it was anyone's intention at Salesforce to pay women less than men. But this is what happens in the market. So one of the things you can do in a pay system is you can make it transparent. You can say, here are the different levels, and here are the pay bands, or even just here is the salary, here's the equity level for these different roles at these different levels. The more transparent you make it, the easier it is for people to come in and not feel cheated. One of the hardest things that any leader has to do is to decide who they're going to lay off or who they're going to fire. And I don't think any of us want to think that we're making those decisions based on bias or prejudice. And yet, I bet if you analyze the data at your company about who you fired, you will find that certain groups who are already underrepresented at your company are overrepresented in who you fire. And you've got to stop and ask yourself a question. Are these people not succeeding at my company because they're not good professionals? Or are they not succeeding at my company or on my team because I'm not supporting them in the right way? And I think you'll find that sometimes people are being fired not because they couldn't make an excellent contribution, but because they have been so consistently bullied that they can't possibly do their best work. And that's a huge waste. When you are quantifying bias in your management systems, what you're really doing is saying, we all have biases. We're not going to punish anyone unduly for their biases, but we're going to try to be aware of them so that they don't skew our decision-making. This is not about politics. This is about how to create organizations in which everyone can do the best work of their lives and build the best relationships of their careers. That's what radical respect is about.
To learn even more from the world's biggest thinkers, get Big Think Plus for your business.